Hello and welcome to episode 196 of the Clean Energy Show from the Fairmont Hotel Vancouver. I'm Brian Stockton.
And I'm James Whittingham at the Clean Energy Show headquarters in the usual place. This week, the city of Vancouver was under a sickening fog from a refinery on Monday, so we immediately sent our best reporter to the scene. It's not my fault, Brian, that you forgot your Clean Energy Show gas mask.
It's fine, really. New York City is looking at replacing natural gas systems with underground district geothermal heating that could serve whole neighborhoods. The only objection is coming from the city's 3 million rats who are against the gentrification of their filthy rat holes.
Turns out wind power saved the Alberta grid from going down in the recent cold snap. It's also saved me at a few gassy picnics I've been to over the years.
And speaking of filthy, some filthy hippies are going to put solar panels on one of the world's largest buildings. That's right, the roof of the Pentagon will soon be covered in solar panels. What's next up there? Beehives, daisies, and a pot farm?
God, those hippies in the military. All that and more in this edition of the Clean Energy Show. And Brian, I would just like to thank everyone who's donated to the show. If you're new to the show, by the way, we've had probably 500,000 to 1 million views of our content. Some things have gone viral again. TikTok is back for the Clean Energy Show. The algorithm is okay. Boosting us again. And so whenever that happens, we bring in new listeners. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We use a sense of humor here to get through the tough things that are in the world, but we're also a very optimistic show. So also this week's show, kids, the disruption of dairy is now underway, years ahead of predictions. This is a huge deal. As coming up at the end of the show, we're going to talk about that. Can you guess, Brian, what North American jurisdiction has the most virtual power plant capacity? I bet you can't, and I'm not going to waste time trying. It's perhaps the place, though, that needs it the most. And 2023 was a bad year for nuclear energy, and it's going to take a big turnaround for ambitions to expand that. How's it going out there?
Yeah, it's good. And also, if you're new to the show, we sometimes go a little off topic from clean energy, and I really try not to, but there is one off-topic thing I want to discuss off the top of the show. I want to pay tribute to the great Norman Jewison, the Canadian film director that passed away very recently at the age of 97. And I just wanted to talk about him because he meant a lot to me. And James, I think that my movie career peaked in the 1990s when I got invited to a development meeting at Norman Jewison's office in Toronto.
Wow. That's did you soil yourself? I mean, that's a big deal, and doesn't, Hollywood coming to you in Toronto.
Yeah, well, let me just go over some of the films on his resume. This is a ridiculous resume, one of the top film directors of the 20th century.
For all those who are new to the show, Brian is a retired filmmaker and a retired film professor. I am a retired/washed up comic actor and film school graduate myself. We sometimes talk about these things.
Yeah, and I just wanted to talk quickly about Norman. He did these films that I'm going to list here. The Russians Are Coming, In the Heat of the Night, The Thomas Crown Affair, Fiddler on the Roof, Jesus Christ Superstar, Rollerball, Moonstruck, and Only You, a romantic comedy that I got to visit the editing suite when he was working on that film. It's a film with Marissa Tomei. So what happened was in the 90s, I was a director resident at the Canadian Film Centre, which is an advanced film school. That's so weird
that there's two connections I have to Marissa Tomei. The other is the executive producer of your feature film that starred me, The Sabbatical from 2015. I was sitting with him in a Robin's Donuts of all places, and Marissa Tomei was texting with him. Because, well, it's a long story, but, if you promise actors money to make films, if you're coming as a rich guy, it happens.
Yeah. So, I was very fortunate to be a director resident at the Canadian Film Centre in the 1990s. It was just getting in was a huge accomplishment. That year there were only 15 people that got in, 5 directors. I was one of 5 directors that year in 1993. And we got to hang out with Norman a few times. We were in the edit suite of Only You, and it was a great experience because they were working on a scene where there was a mistake, there was a flub, there was a blooper, where Marissa Tomei was getting into a cab or something, and I think she was wearing a wedding dress, and something weird happened that wasn't supposed to, and they were trying to fit it into the movie. And I love that, because I love those kind of happy accidents on movies. And we got to watch them in the editing room as they were trying to figure out how to get this blooper to actually work in the movie. Then I saw the movie. It turns out they didn't manage to make it work. It wasn't in there, but that's the fun thing about making movies. Yeah, so got to hang out with Norman a few times. I made a short film at the Canadian Film Centre called The Weight of the World, and I'm actually in the midst of doing a 4K restoration of this film. It's a short 15-minute film that, after I went through the program, I got to make this short film with a huge, 30-person crew and a semi-trailer full of equipment. And it was incredibly fun. The film ended up doing really well. I'm here in Vancouver. It won an award at the Vancouver International Film Festival. So that was a real highlight, the whole film center experience. And then Norman said some really nice things about the film. And I ended up, having a relationship with his development executive. So that was an amazing sort of vote of confidence from Norman. It didn't end up going anywhere. We didn't, they were trying to help me get a fefeature film going, and it never happened at the time. But that's a common thing in the film industry. You develop lots of things that never quite happen. But just wanted to salute the great Norman Jewison.
Yeah, even though he's 97, it's kind of sad that he's gone. A great Canadian director from...
Yeah, a huge Hollywood figure, but a real important figure in Canadian film, and an important figure to me and lots of Canadian filmmakers.
Right. Well, Brian, there was a Vancouver air quality alert sent out, Monday, the day that you were in the air to get there.
Yeah.
You had to fly through it. This is kind of a weird thing, because I live near a refinery, so it sort of struck close to home.
Many people across Metro Vancouver woke up Sunday morning to a strong smell of burning. The Burnaby Fire Department says it attended an industrial incident at a Burnaby refinery. Parkland, the company that owns the refinery, along with the RCMP and firefighters, responded to an issue with one of its processing units Sunday morning. City News received reports from concerned callers spanning from Coquitlam to Kitsilano, some of them feeling dizzy or sick from the burning smell.
Now, they blamed it ultimately in a very awkward way, saying that we burn our own stuff so that we can heat the other stuff up and refine it. And the fire department equated it to burning cooking oil. And that's frightening to think that they would lie. Because, anything that makes you sick. And the thing is also, this is a major world city that was entirely blanketed by this smell. People were dizzy. People were told to go indoors. You were getting off a plane. And, great timing.
I just got off the plane, and you saw your text. And although I have to say, from where we have been, it doesn't seem to have affected us. I think that I'm upwind where we are in downtown Vancouver.
But it went all the way to UBC, from Burnaby to UBC. So that would, pretty much include you. But it did start, I think, around 7 a.m, and they gave the alert at about 1 o'clock hour of local time.
Yeah. Lots of people feeling nauseous from that. And it's terrible.
Now I live, inches away from various pipelines that are for some reason go through the city, and they send out literature all the time. It's scary. I'm told that there's bad things that can happen with that pipeline, which is why a plane flies over it, every day or so. And also the refinery is just disgusting when the wind comes this way. And what a world we would live in if we didn't need these freaking fossil fuels. They're disgusting. Yes, they helped move civilization forward, but we're done with them. We don't need them anymore. And I can't wait for future generations to look back and ponder them doing that, Brian, is us looking back at Victorian times with coal smoke around, we thought, well, that's pretty archaic. I'd hate to live then. Well, people will look back at us now. A lot of people die from the pollution caused by fossil fuels. Up to 7 million from air pollution in general, says the World Health Organization. And if you take wood burning and indoor air pollutants out of that picture, then it's all fossil fuels that we can replace, that we're in a position to replace, to completely get rid of. except for maybe a little bit during the transition. But for the most part, we can fix that. Just air pollution kills at least 3 million people worldwide a year. That's more than the COVID pandemic has in total. And that's ongoing. Every year is a COVID pandemic because of these fossil fuels, which is one thing you could say that's okay because we need them. We don't need them, though. We don't need them anymore.
Yeah. We've accepted it this long because they were necessary, but now they're not, so we have to stop accepting it.
And I saw Killers of the Flower Moon, the Martin Scorsese film. That's 3.5 hours. It's on Apple TV. I signed up for Apple TV again to get it, and I rotate my streaming services to save money. Very good film. It's not going to be the best film of the year, I don't think, or anything like that, but it's a very good film, and it certainly talks about the greed that oil causes, because an indigenous community reservation in the United States was given this crappy land, and then later they found out there was oil on it, lots of oil, so all the indigenous people got rich, and the outsiders didn't like that, so they started killing them. And not to ruin the film or anything, but it just goes to show, well, it's racism for one thing, but it's also greed. And to me, that greed is still there because they're not just killing indigenous people, they're killing us all by trying to make more money to prolong fossil fuels. So in my mind, this goes on.
Yeah, haven't seen it yet, but I will watch it soon.
Also wanted to discuss the Oscar nominations were out today. It did well. Alberta grid, what really happened. So not just this past weekend, but the weekend before, there was this deep, deep freeze that hit the Canadian prairies, and that's where Brian and I normally are. We're next door to Alberta in Saskatchewan, but that grid had problems. It sent out multiple alerts, which freaked people out because, it's one thing to say, okay, conserve electricity or the grid's going to go down, but it was minus 50, and minus 40. Minus 30s, depending on where you were. Like I think it was minus 46 in one place. So the average temperature across most of the province was minus 31 when this started on January 11th, what I believe was a Friday. And so the Alberta Energy System Operator registered a new hourly electricity demand record, which was only up slightly from December 22's record. However, they would have had problems because Friday use of electricity is down a little bit from the rest of the week. And it's way down on the weekend because of industrial operations. I guess people slack off on Fridays or, maybe just don't do as much. But 1.1 gigawatts was coming in from wind that day on Friday. Otherwise, some people say the grid would have gone down. So people are blaming wind for not blowing when the alerts actually came out on the weekend because the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't shining. So the fact is, it saved the grid. The grid probably would have gone down on Friday. So that triggered a series of 4 alerts over as many days. And yeah, people are not happy about it and they want to blame something. So they're blaming renewables, which is odd because we all, if you listen to the show on a regular basis, we give you examples of stories of time after time where the renewables and battery storage have saved grids, have made them more stable. In the future, that's the kind of future we're going to live in, is a more stable grid. I'm sick of power outages here. The wind was only putting out 20 megawatts instead of 1.1 gigawatts, which is a tiny, tiny fraction. If it wasn't a surprise because their wind forecast was actually dead on, Brian. They knew this was coming. It's not like wind was unpredictable. They actually have forecasting algorithms that check everything out and tell you what's going to happen, how much electricity is going to be produced and when, what time of day. And all that worked out fine. So in the event that it happened during the week, it would have been a problem, they say. Experts have been piping up about this after the fact. So wind actually saved the grid's butt. Each time, shortly after they were issued, demand plummeted and the alerts were lifted. Yeah, of the 14 energy-conserving tips provided by the regulator when they came out with these alerts, one to avoid was charging your electric car. And of course, because we're not the most progressive people here on the prairies of Canada. There's not a lot of electric cars. There may be 10,000 of them or something like that in Alberta, but there's not, it was an insignificant thing of, part of the discussion. For one thing, most cars would actually be charged at the time. We're going to talk more about disinformation later in the show. But most cars aren't always charging. They're charged, or they're charged, a small fraction of them are charging at any given time. There really wasn't that many of them. It's a population of several million people. So it's a small fraction. Plus, consumers are only like 20% of the electricity use. It's actually, industrial processes in Alberta take up the majority of it. And there's other things too, like agriculture. There's been just a flow of misinformation and hatred towards the solutions to climate change that we discuss on the show, and we'll talk more later in the show.
Yeah, a clothes dryer uses about the same amount of electricity as plugging an electric car, and obviously there's way more electric clothes dryers.
How about telling people not to dry their clothes, huh? How about that?
Yeah.
Don't dry your clothes or to cook a turkey.
Wait, they didn't do that? No. They didn't tell people not to dry clothes?
They said they brought in, so now everybody thinks electric cars are the problem. Because people, unfortunately, are misinformed and dumb. I really have to work hard to keep up with everything that we talk about on the show. And your average Joe's not going to do that. 2 gas plants. It was actually gas plants that had shut down or underproduced because of the cold weather. This happened in Texas a couple of years ago, too. The gas was the major contributor to it. Apparently, they don't have much battery storage there, but it's actually saved the grid for hours before they had to put out these alerts. The batteries actually started, and we had more of them, which we will and need to as fast as possible. Yeah. So there was only a small connection to our grid here in Saskatchewan, the size of one small gas plant or one medium-sized solar farm. Pembina Institute study says that a green grid by 2035 would save ratepayers in that province $600 per year. And of course, everyone thinks the opposite because they're told the opposite. You could say whatever you want. If it's negative, people lap it up. I should have a negative YouTube channel talking about, gas cars. Maybe I should just go negative and people, gas cars aren't new to people, so they're not going to freak out. Anything that's new and not quite understood. And our premier here, the boss, the political boss of our province said that, we gave them lots of fossil fuels to save their butt, when in fact, we took in more than we gave them from the province next door, which has a bunch of hydro. It's almost all hydro. So we were actually using a non-fossil fuel source to make up for what we were giving them and then some. So it's the world we live in. Politics, people are coming out against so much. So we'll see what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on that. So again, the cold snap that we talked about last week, and there were certain problems there was a big news story about Chicago, where there was a huge deep freeze and there were electric cars piling up at the charging stations. And so, of course, again, lots of negative news stories. Now, there was a lot of truth to this problem. It was a genuine problem, and it comes from, a few different things, a lack of education about how these things work, for one. But Out of Spec Reviews on YouTube had a really good breakdown of what happened in Chicago and why it was a problem for electric car charging, and I thought it was really interesting. For one thing, in Chicago, a lot of new Uber drivers on the Uber network driving electric cars. So Uber has a deal with Tesla where the drivers can rent Teslas. But if a lot of them come on to the system at one time, and if a lot of those Uber drivers don't have home charging, which is often the case, then they can only charge at the superchargers. And so that also means that your car is going to deep freeze overnight. So if you don't have home charging, it's generally not a huge problem if you're always charging at a fast charger. But what happens in a cold snap is if it's not plugged in overnight, it gets sort of cold soaked, and then that battery takes extra time to warm up when you plug it into the fast charger just to be able to accept a charge. So it could be sitting there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, even 30 or 45 minutes if it's really, really cold, and it'll look like it's not charging, but what it's doing is just warming the battery. So that was one of the problems. A lot of people plugged in, not getting any juice, thinking that the chargers were broken when they weren't. But even if they did think the chargers were working, well, it's a problem because, you're waiting for 30 minutes just to warm up the battery. And this leads to a backup of people at the chargers. And I was talking about my partner drove to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in the north and didn't have problems with our Tesla Model S, partly because it's got really good range and because it preconditions the battery when you're on the road before you get to the charger. And when it's nice and warm, preconditioned. It accepts a
so
very
they
fast
probably didn't
charge.
have enough time to do this, Brian, when they're going from their apartment to the closest supercharger, unlike your partner on the highway, which you can program and it knows in advance and makes a decision to heat up the battery. We're talking very cold weather here, and she was in much colder weather than Chicago had.
And, the solution may have been for those Uber drivers to find like maybe a level 2 station where you can just leave it for a while. Now, of course, you're not earning your income then as an Uber driver, but I just wanted to point out, because I don't think I mentioned it last week, but so she was in Prince Albert for about 3 days, minus, 35 Celsius kind of temperature. She did keep it plugged in to a 110 outlet, the whole time she was there. And that keeps the battery from having that deep freeze, so that when she did go to the supercharger before she left town, she was already accepting a decent charge. So you just plug it into a regular 110 outlet. When it's that cold, you don't add any charge really to the battery. It just sort of keeps it at the same level. I think over a couple of days, she actually lost a couple of percent. But
that doesn't happen with my Leaf. That's interesting. My Leaf has a smaller battery and uses, I can look at the data, it uses between 200 and 400 watts. So if you're looking at around 1,200 total, it uses, a third of it and still charges, which is a problem actually that I can talk about. Yeah,
but I think it's a thing people don't often know. It's sort of natural to us because, as we've often talked about, everyone around here has a block heater on their gas car, which is a heater that just keeps the engine block warm when it's minus 20, minus 30. And we all just know that, okay, best practice is to just plug in your block heater overnight on your gas car. Well, it was a very natural thing for us to do the same thing with the electric car. It's like, minus 35. Just keep it plugged in, and that keeps it from, that absolute deep freeze, which then, limits your charging.
There's a saying in the electric car community, ABC, always be charging.
Yeah.
So a block heater in a car, most of you won't know what that is. That is a little heater, resistive heater in the oil pan to keep the oil from turning into thick molasses, so that when you turn it over, it's not pushing against something that's thick and, sludge-like. Instead, it's more liquidy.
Yeah, and it helps your gas car actually start when it's minus 30. Now, and wanted to mention quickly, in the city of Calgary in Alberta, when they had the deep freeze, gas pumps actually froze.
Really?
So sure, some electric car chargers did freeze, and they do sometimes have problems when it's that
Even the
cold.
Tesla ones, which are known to be reliable, have gone down in Saskatchewan here during the deep freeze. But there was still some available.
It went on long enough in Calgary. It must have been, I don't know, that wind. It was just such a nasty wind.
The wind was the X factor here, Brian.
Yeah.
Because, I've had 42 below with the Leaf before, but the wind did something to it. And I know wind doesn't affect inanimate objects, generally speaking, because they don't have evaporative skin. But it can take away any built-up temperature that you have that's sort of radiating from the battery, and just keep it cool, because it's constantly replacing it with the temperature of the outside air.
Yeah. Wind chill is a measure of heat loss. And so it can mean that your car, you're right, it's an inanimate object, but it can mean that it's colder for longer. Like, it knocks the heat out of it quicker. So instead of being completely cold for maybe only 5 hours, it's completely frozen for 10 hours. It just cools down super fast. But yeah, some of the gas pumps in Calgary actually froze, and they did not work.
That's amazing.
Onto a story here from Canary Media, district heating in New York State and New York City. We've talked a little bit about district heating before. It's a thing that's much more common in Europe, but it's the idea that you can do something like geothermal heat for an entire block, an entire neighborhood, and it's more cost effective than doing it one property, one building at a time. So New York State, they've got 13 pilot projects ready to go ahead with these kind of district heating kind of solutions. Their idea is to leverage the expertise of the gas industry to do this. So you can't just sort of reuse the gas piping, the natural gas piping, to pipe heat or water or steam. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. But much like we've talked about geothermal drilling, where you go down really deep and get super hot water, and you can use that to generate electricity. Well, you can use people from the oil industry to do that work, because it's very, very similar, where you can use the oil drilling equipment to do it. Well, you can use the expertise in the natural gas industry to do piping that works for district heat as well. So yeah, the idea is you spread out the cost over several buildings. They're even thinking of doing it for 30 Rockefeller Center
Wow.
in New York City. So this is on the docket as a pilot project that they would heat 30 Rock. This is the NBC building in New York City where Saturday Night Live and many TV shows are filmed. It's an enormous building, absolutely huge.
Probably uses
but
an unfathomable amount of energy to keep it warm in the winter.
Yeah, it's absolutely hard to imagine. So there's another instance here in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. They're going to get 100% of their heating, cooling, and hot water needs for a low-income, multifamily residential building from a nearby data center. So you can mine heat from many different places. So geothermal, you just put the pipes down underground low enough. There's always a constant temperature, and you can farm that and heat your building. But you can also get it from drains and sewers, and there's always heat around, like a sewer system and whatnot. And in this case, a data center. Data centers produce a ton of extra heat.
They do.
Guess what? You can harvest that heat and put it through a geothermal heat exchanger.
Because even in the wintertime, they're going to spend on cooling of that data center, right? There's all kinds of interesting things going on where they're talking about putting data centers in the Arctic, or having backup data centers in the Arctic and switching to there when necessary, just because there's, some of the major companies like Google and have so much data processing that it's warming the planet.
Yeah. So this great project's going on in New York. And like a lot of these clean energy things, it's going to cost a lot of money up front. But in the long run, it saves you money. It's cheaper because you get rid of things like fuel costs. You no longer have to pay for natural gas. And that's often, half the cost of a bill for heating is the natural gas. Well, you eliminate that and it is cheaper in the long run.
All right, Brian, guess where the most virtual power plants are? What's a virtual power plant? It is when you have batteries distributed around in homes or businesses, and the power grid calls on those to save it from blackouts. And sometimes, if there's a high demand, it works as a giant peaker plant. Well, it's not California. It's not Texas. It's Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the place that actually needs it the most because it is ravaged by hurricanes, so much so that the population is rapidly declining there. People are going to the mainland U.S. because life is not good if you're constantly rebuilding from hurricanes. Well, things are changing. This is from Grist. This is published on January 16th. Puerto Rico has begun using batteries connected to residents' rooftop solar panels to provide backup power for its grid, helping to prevent blackouts and offering an alternative to fossil fuel burning peaker plants. Peaker plants are very expensive to build, and they're there as a backup or at just peak moments so that the grid doesn't go down when suddenly the demand increases. Well, you can take that demand from a whole bunch of little batteries, not tiny batteries, but, home batteries that are powered from solar. And most people, there's a lot of places in the world like this, but they're putting solar panels up, yes, but they're also pairing it with batteries because you want to have that stability in your own home, that power backup for days on end, if you're thrifty enough with your electricity use. Yeah, so everyone you can afford solar panels is getting the battery as well. So there's a lot of them around and increasing rapidly. It could be the first step towards building one of the largest virtual power plants of its kind. VPP capacity by 2030 could supply 10 to 20% of its peak demand. Doing so could also save the U.S. as much as $10 billion annually by preventing the need to build new infrastructure or fire up peaker plants. That's the United States as a whole. If, they're planning and their goal is to increase the virtual power plant supply 10 to 20% of its peak demand, which would mean that those peaker plants wouldn't be used as much. In the meantime, as we always see, huge savings of money. So Puerto Rico is uniquely equipped for a residential storage VPP because nearly all of its rooftop solar arrays wasn't one battery, and people really want the backup option. So more than 100,000 households in Puerto Rico, which is a lot, have a rooftop solar, and they're installing about 4,000 new systems per month. So it's really taking off. In a territory with a little over 3 million people, that's a lot, Brian, a big uptake. And of course, it's got good solar potential, mostly sunny, lots of sunshine, long days and all that. And not seasonally adjusted days for short days in the winter or anything like that. Yeah, growth could speed up more because there's a new federal program to help fund it, including an effort underway by the Energy Department to spend $500 million on systems for vulnerable households, which is great.
Yeah, that's great.
That's, about as much as some people make with their solar generation. So you get that, and then your payoff period is a lot faster. And not only that, but you get bonuses if they end up using it a lot. But you could set you could tell it that I don't want my battery to go below 80%. But even that top 20% that the grid uses is there to keep it stable, while they turn on other stuff to make up for that demand, because batteries are instant. So that's very cool.
All right. I want to dip into the mailbag here. I've got 2 letters I want to cover. The first is from my brother Paul, and he wants to correct us like he so often does.
You son of, who do you think you are, Paul Stockton? You sitting there in your ivory throne. We work hard on this show.
Okay, so Paul says, listening to your podcast, it sounds like you would think that they would have to climb a mountain in Tibet to erect wind turbines at 4,600 meters.
That's right.
But a large swath of Tibet is a plateau. The Friendship Highway runs from Kathmandu at 1,700 meters to Lhasa at 3,700 meters. The highway tops out at 5,200 meters. I drove it in a Land Rover, so to erect wind turbines, they would just have to drive them along the highway to the spot where they want to put them up.
So your brother crossed Canada on a recumbent bike, and he crossed Tibet in a Land Rover. The man's on the move.
Apparently, yes. So I hope I didn't suggest that people were climbing up mountains carrying wind turbines, because that would be a little impractical. But I stand by the initial point, which is it's going to be harder to erect wind turbines at 4,600 meters than it is at sea level.
Sure.
It's just a natural consequence of having to move
altitude
things
sickness at 100 meters, so
And altitude sickness, and as I discussed in the story, just more extreme conditions can happen way up there in the altitude. So just wanted to cover that. All right, so second letter here. Hey, James and Brian, I am Aaron, a dedicated Clean Energy Show listener. Your words and info make me feel like there is indeed good in the world, despite all the local fliff-floff we hear in and around Regina of how crappy EVs are and how solar will never work. Lately, I seem to find myself tense and angry after setting people straight on Facebook about EV information, getting yelled at with more misinformation, and then unfollowing old friends. More and more, I can take a deep breath, turn on a Clean Energy Show episode, and instantly feel justified in all those stats I can never remember. I don't even have an EV, but the minute I can get a loan, I'll be doing my Lumsden commute in a Tesla, leaving a rooftop covered in solar panels in my rear view mirror. It is my dream. Anyways, the main reason I wanted to write was Brian was talking about how he wants to insulate more and such, but needs to brace his foundation. Didn't sound like he knew much about it. Very true. So I am a carpenter, building inspector in the city, and just wanted to let you know about foundation repair. It's big business in our city with the clay soils. Prices can range from $1,500 to $10,000 or more. Bracing walls from the inside with steel C-channels cemented onto the ground and braced to the joist up to the top. Some people choose to get new interior weeping tile and set it up with their sump pump, but only if water is getting in. Thanks for your time and perspectives. Peace, love, and banana bread, Aaron from Lumsden.
Does that mean we're getting banana bread?
I definitely. What's that?
Does that mean we're getting banana bread? I mean, checking my mailbox now. I don't see any.
I hope so. So it's very true. I do not know a lot about foundations, but I don't think I need bracing for the walls. My understanding is the worst thing in foundations is horizontal cracks. And as far as I know, we don't have any of those. I just need to lift the house. The front of the house is 2 inches lower than the back of the house. So I don't think bracing is what I need. But if anybody knows what I need, please let me know, because I'm really not sure what we need. And for now, we've just been letting it go and it's fine. She had a recommendation of a local foundation repair place.
Yeah.
So
my first house was the wartime house. Remember that A-frame house? It had all kinds of vertical cracks in the foundation, which concerned me. So I think I had a structural engineer look at it, and he said that the verticals are okay. However, one was wide enough to let in air, so I filled it with expanding foam from a can. But now they said that they could brace it by doing that. Like an engineer comes in and cements, steel beams, vertical steel beams.
Aaron's letter reminded me of an article that was recently on Bloomberg, and the headline is "Attacks on Renewable Energy Are Proliferating on YouTube." While overtly denying human-made climate change are declining on certain YouTube channels, while those going after climate solutions are ramping up. So this is just, we're at a certain kind of inflection point where maybe when we started this podcast 4 years ago, it was just rampant on places like YouTube, social media, that climate change is not real and false information about that. Well, the good news is it's now shifting, and the false information is about the solutions to climate change. So what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, where people say, oh, electric cars don't work, solar and wind on the grid don't work because it's cold snap, et cetera, et cetera. So it is progress of a kind. There's less outright denial of the fact that climate change is real. People are starting to accept that climate change is real, but now they're attacking, the solutions to climate change, which is just, it's almost even more disheartening because it's like, well, what's the solution then? Do nothing? Like that's the only, if electric cars, solar panels, and wind doesn't really work, then you just have to give up and do nothing. And that's incredibly depressing.
That's what the fossil fuel industry would like you to do, and Russian misinformation bots and everything else. It's incredible.
Yeah.
This cold snap has brought out a swarm of misinformation. I get messages daily from friends saying, so-and-so said this. Is that true? And no, it's not. And listen to our goddamn podcast. You got to know what's going on. We are in touch with the world of facts and reality. And we don't mistrust news source. We don't mistrust scientists. We look at what they are presenting and try and present that to you, the listener. And it's ridiculous what is going on here. They do note in the article that it's the effects of climate change are becoming too real. They're hard to ignore. I mean, for us, we had a smoky summer every damn day last year and no blue sky, no pure blue sky, hardly at all. You can't ignore the effects of climate change, which is depressing as hell. So now they've moved on to other things. But it's wrong. And one Tesla breaks down, it's a national news story. Do you know how many bloody ICE cars, gas and diesel that I've passed that have broken down? Not on the national news.
My hairdresser, I got my haircut before my trip. She said in that cold snap, she literally saw like several gasoline cars on fire. I don't know what about the cold. On fire, burning. It wasn't just one. It wasn't just two. It was at least, she had seen 3 or 4 cars on fire. I don't know how the cold necessarily does that, and maybe it's not related, but this is a problem. So it was the Nonprofit Center for Countering Digital Hate that did this study. They monitor all of these, YouTube channels and social media for misinformation, and that's how they track it, and that is how it's shifting in 2024.
Yeah, it's depressing. It's disheartening. It's hard to deal with. It's a virus that can't be stopped. It's just, you put out one fire, it starts on another. Like it's whack-a-mole. It's just constant crap coming my way. I was at the camera shop the other day, and the guy saying, "Hey, what's your podcast about that you're buying equipment for?" And I said, "Well, it's about this." And he says, "Well, nuclear, eh? Huh? Nuclear, huh?" He said it like that. And Tesla's a nuclear, huh? And I said, "Okay, well, we don't have a positive outlook for nuclear on the show based on what we've been reading." And he said, "But small modular." And I said, "Those don't exist yet." He was shocked. He thought you could go buy one off the shelf. Like, people just don't realize that you're pinning our hopes on something that's not ready yet and may or may not be financially doable by the time it happens. There's going to be competition from other things. And, batteries are hard to wrap your head around, but man, 2023 was a huge year for batteries, and 2024 is going to be even better. So it's hard to think of batteries powering a grid, but they can. And the thing is, they're getting better, that there's a gigafactory almost every day being announced in somewhere in the world. And, the research and the money going into it is so great. And the fact is that there's too much of it now, and the battery prices are dropping. So that's going to speed things along. We're going to be in a really boom cycle for batteries because the prices are down. But yeah, it's frustrating. Brian, I've got a letter here from my friend Mike, who's also local. It's funny how we're getting so many local letters this week. Hello, local people. It says, hey, sorry for the late response, because I called him out on the show before. I said, hey, I want to know if you're listening. Apparently he's behind. Come on, Mike, get with it.
Get with it.
Talking about winter driving as an Ioniq 5, I was curious because Hyundai is one of the non-Tesla vehicles that has sort of preheating of the battery, and I wondered how that was working. He says he doesn't know. So I really don't do long winter drive trips, so I'm not sure how long it charges on the highway or how fast it charges in the extreme cold. I did get the battery preconditioning update over the air this fall, so that should help in the city. The Ioniq 5 is by far the best winter driving experience I've ever had, and that's true, I think, for everyone. I don't know anyone with a modern EV, they basically say that. Even here, where it's the coldest frickin' place in the world with human beings, a podcast. I usually end up charging at home twice a week with my driving habits in the extreme cold, so range in the city is never a concern, and I don't have to stand outside to refuel my vehicle and freeze my ass off. Note, this is one of the best things about electric cars, even in the summer. That is true. People ask you, and what's the best thing? And that often comes up. Like, you don't realize how good it is not to have to go to a gas station until you don't have to go to a gas station for a year. And then suddenly you find yourself filling a rental car or something. And it's like, this is ridiculous. So no more standing around smelling gas, filling up your car. The heat pump heats the car very quickly. The Ioniq 5 has a heat pump to heat it up efficiently. And in fact, by the time I get to my car after work, all the snow and ice is melted off. I don't have to scrape my windows. And I have all-wheel drive, so the car is very good in the ice, even without winter tires. Oh, Mike, you daring boy. You're worse than me. Car starts the same in minus 40 and plus 30. I've said that before in my videos. It's true. You don't know the difference. There's no, there's none of that. It's just bing, let's go. And you take off. That's my friend Mike in Regina, Canada, where it gets down to the minus 40 Celsius and Fahrenheit. Terrible, terrible cold.
Yeah, Fahrenheit and Celsius meet at minus 40. Okay, so a story here from Electrek about the Pentagon. And we talked recently about when Jimmy Carter was in the White House, he put up solar panels on the roof, and we had a listener who was involved in that even.
He was involved in scouting the White House for the Clinton administration for giving a bid on it. Right. But it was related. It was related.
But Ronald Reagan took those solar panels down because he was a jerk. But now it's many years later, and the Pentagon under the Biden administration is going to go ahead and install rooftop solar. The Pentagon is one of the largest buildings in the entire world, and it's not that tall. So what does that mean? It's got a gigantic roof area.
It's the opposite of 30 Rock. It's spread out laterally. So yeah.
That's right. So a different strategy is needed. So they're going to install a heat recovery heat pump system and solar thermal panels, as well as photovoltaic solar to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. The solar panels and heat pump system will power over 95% of space heating and hot water heating, currently powered by natural gas and oil. The Pentagon, which has over 6.6 million square feet of floor area and houses 26,000 employees, is aiming to achieve net zero. So the potential savings of over 7 million kilowatt hours of electricity and 128,000 BTUs of natural gas they will no longer need will lead to an estimated annual total energy cost reduction of $1.36 million.
Which
That's how much they're going to save on their energy bill. That's right. So 30 Rock is probably maybe a similar, well, it's probably not as big, but if they're going to save 1.36 million on their power bill, that means the power bill's, probably in the millions for giant buildings like that. So like a lot of things, going to cost a lot upfront, cheaper in the long run. And another sort of footnote in here, they're also going to do some photovoltaic film on south-facing windows at the Department of Transportation. And this is a technology we've kind of heard about a little bit over the years, where you put a thin film on regular windows and you can use that to generate power. So far as I know, it hasn't really been, practical enough or cheap enough or whatever, but it sounds like it's maybe starting to come, and they're going to do this with photovoltaic film on windows at the Department of Transportation.
So the Apple complex, the big donut-shaped spaceship-like thing, they're covered with solar, right? Like that's an example of a sprawling, only a few story high, but vast complex using solar because you have the roof space, right?
Yeah. I don't know their total energy usage or how much the solar generates, but that was definitely always part of the plan when Apple built that building, large roof area, putting up lots of solar.
All right. So we have some nuclear news this week, Brian. This week at Nuclear. This is from reneweconomy.au. 2023 was another bust for nuclear. 5 startups and 5 closures. So there was 5 reactors starting up and 5 that were closed down. But it's a net loss of 1.7 gigawatts of potential electricity output. The share of global electricity of nuclear was 9.2%, and that is the lowest in 40 years. And it is half of its 1996 peak of 17.5%. So what you have is a boom in the 60s and 70s, and that sort of held over into the 80s because they were planned. But then because of the disasters from 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, things slowed down. And those plants are retiring. And it's going to take a big... Probably not going to happen, but it's going to take a big amount of government investment. Nuclear has gone backwards, and wind and solar, of course, have enjoyed ridiculous record growth. This is from Bloomberg. The UK government will invest an additional $1.7 billion to build the Sizewell C nuclear plant to try and entice private investors back to the project. The government will be the majority shareholder in Sizewell and is hoping to attract enough capital to make the final investment decision this year. The extra cash follows $900 million put into it in November 22 and another $650 last summer. So, it's expensive. And unfortunately, the costs balloon beyond prediction, and the private sector is wanting to stay out of it. They say nuclear plant construction is notoriously tricky, typically plagued by cost overruns and delays that make investors wary. The government support is meant to help lower that risk. But I tell you, I think people who go big on nuclear are going to spend lots of money that maybe didn't need to be spent.
If, we had started all this nuclear stuff 20 years ago, it might have been a good solution. But because we didn't start it 20 years ago, we can't have all of this coming online 20 years from now at a massive, massive cost. It's just too slow and too expensive when wind and solar and batteries can be done so much quicker.
It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
This is from Yale Environment. If the U.S. is to reach its climate goals, solar arrays will cover an area larger than Maryland. Now, Maryland's not that big, but still, it's a state. Growing native flowers and grasses at these sites could give a much-needed boost to imperiled insects, a new study has found. So yes, combining flowers and grasses, which is easy to do with solar, that could help the environment. A tornado watch for the whole of Ireland, western and southern Scotland was issued on January 21st. Brian, this is very unusual. In fact,
I imagine
people don't remember it happening before, but that is our changing planet. Today, the U.S. has 169,000 electric vehicle chargers in 65,000 locations across the country. That is a 70% increase since friend of the show, Joe Biden, took office. He wanted us to tell you that, so we are.
Hi, Joe.
Britain's grid operator has paid households and businesses over £9 million so far this winter to curb their power use under the program to save energy. This is something that we're seeing more of, is paying people so that, the grid is not going to be just a different source. It's going to be transformed, and it's going to act in a different way. We're going to have incentives to use it when there's an abundance, and an incentive to not use it when there's a lack thereof, right? And pay homeowners perhaps too. Oh, it's time for a CS Fast Fact. It now costs more to install solar than it is to make the panels. That's from DW.
But it makes sense because, especially on a rooftop solar at your house, actually installing them is a huge job.
Azerbaijan adds 12 women to the organizing committee of the COP29 climate summit to be held in Baku this year, after the government was criticized for including none in the original lineup. Oops, forgot women.
Oops.
Half the population of the world. VDA-sized square lithium batteries from CATL and BYD are dropping as low as $56 per kilowatt hour. That is, I think, a pouch, the square-shaped pouch batteries that they're making. That's incredibly cheap and not supposed to happen, but that's what they're at. So, wow.
Amazing.
Oil ban.
Well, we haven't had an oil ban in a while. EU lawmakers agree to a deal to curb diesel truck pollution. The law will ban sales of almost all new diesel trucks in the bloc by 2040. Not all of them, but most of them. MEPs and member states on Thursday agreed to the terms of the legislation under which manufacturers will have to reduce the average emissions of new HDVs sold in the EU by 45% between 2020 and 2030, increasing to 90% by 2040. The legislation must now be ratified in Parliament before coming into force, and it's another CS fast fact. 5.5 million Japanese jobs rely on the internal combustion engine, Brian. 5.5 million on the... That's why they don't want to get rid of them in Japan. The automakers there are not keen to get rid of them. But, if they don't transition, it's not like those jobs are going to stay. They're just going to suddenly disappear one day, and that's not going to be good. The Tesla Model Y was Europe's best-selling car in 2023, period. Not best-selling EV, best-selling vehicle, the first EV to take the top spot. New research from the University of Hawaii, available on Science Direct, says every 10 centimeters of hood height on a vehicle contributes to a 22% increase in fatalities. I will point out, everyone talks about how dangerous the Cybertruck is, but the Ford F-150 Lightning actually has a higher hood. You can't see kids. That's the problem, and it's not good. Pedestrian hit by a full-size SUV are twice as likely to be killed compared to being struck by a passenger car. But no, we need our SUVs. And finally this week, from disruption analyst Tony Seba, in 2019, his think tank Rethink X forecast cost parity for precision fermentation proteins by 2025 to be cost parity with milk, real milk, fake milk, real milk. This is identical chemically and made kind of like a brewery, or like they make insulin or yeast in a brewery. The fermentation is how their companies are disrupting agriculture. So this is his report, was that 2025 would be the year. Guess what? It's happened now, right now, because Imagine Dairy, that's a company that makes precision fermentation dairy products, proteins, to be specific. Its CEO has told Green Queen that their dairy prototype formulation is already at price parity with traditional dairy products today, right now. Like, this is the stuff that we think we'll be covering in 2030, and boom, it's one of these things that has snuck up on us and has happened now. Wow. This is important because a great deal of dairy is company to company. Dairy proteins for protein shakes, for example, or chocolate bars, or different food products. They're not sold to consumers directly. And if you can get that protein cheaper and it's identical, it's going to happen. So dairy is in for some painful future right now, starting now. This is chemically identical to real milk protein, but cheaper, with a tiny fraction of the land being used. This is from PETA now. Unlike milk stolen from mother cows, brewing dairy with precision fermentation can make lactose and cholesterol-free products to improve its nutritional profile. Additionally, it doesn't contain residues of growth hormones or antibiotics, which many U.S. dairy farms dose their cows with. And this next bit is from the Food Institute. Rethink X suggests that the benefits of precision fermentation are financial, healthful, and environmental. PF products will be cheaper, and American families will save as much as $1,200 a year eventually on food as a result. Currently, animals are used as bioreactors. Animals eat basic grains and then convert them into nutrients. However, this conversion can go, on occasion, awry. A recent report by Biomarket Insights noted how animals often pass on disease, which means there's a constant fight between veterinary antibiotics and bacterial resistance. And from Rethink X, PF, Percision fermentation eliminates the need for animal farming, and thus it reduces the danger of some animal-borne diseases. By skipping animals, we can dramatically reduce the resources needed to produce some basic ingredients. For example, milk proteins produced via precision fermentation require up to 10 times less water, 100 times less land, 5 times less energy, and 25 times less feedstock compared to the same proteins from cows, all the while reducing emissions and having a safer food source. It's amazing, Brian, that this has come, and we'll talk more about it in the future.
Yes, and if we've mentioned on the show before, you mentioned insulin. Insulin used to come entirely from animals, a medication that people need for diabetes. It used to come from pigs, and then we figured out a way to not have to use animals to do that, and this is where we're headed with lots of things, and that is our show for this week. Please take the time to contact us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com, and around social media. You can find us as Clean Energy Pod.
Thanks to all the people who donated last week. There is still donations coming in. Very generous of you. One day down the road, perhaps we'll have different ways of supporting the show financially where you can get some perks. But have a look at the Clean Energy Show store if you'd like to wear our show on your body. If you're new to the show, we always ask that you subscribe on your favorite podcast app, because we do this every darn week, Brian. And we'll see you next week from God knows where, but we'll see you.
See you next week from a secret location.
Secret? Ooh, maybe it's the Pentagon.